Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lisa. As David said, I'm here to talk about the Election Code Amendment, but more importantly, to give a little bit of a history and a background and an understanding of kind of the history and the changing context of counsel. So I'm going to run through some stuff today. It's going to give you a little bit of a background, and I think it's also going to give you, following the financial audit presentation and exactly what was said earlier by Jackie and Jasmine, your nation's wealth is changing, and where that wealth comes from is also changing. And the days of Indian Act kind of DIA monies forming the foundation of your nation's governance are really changing. And what hasn't changed is how counsel is thinking about strategically, how do we grow, how do we move forward, how do we start to think about the changes that are coming. I've always believed that Saik'uz is ahead of the game. I think that this just confirms it more and more. So I'm going to go through this now and give you some opportunity to understand the powers of counsel, kind of the responsibilities of counsel, and the changing context of counsel. So for the agenda, we're going to do this overview of the history of the band counsel system, where it comes from. We're going to look at this thing called fiduciary responsibility, and at the heart of this changing context is also fiduciary responsibility of counsel. We're going to look at the changing role of counsel and explore that, how your counsel is looking to explore that through governance, through some of the policies and election code, those kinds of pieces, and particularly how they're doing it in a strategic growth perspective. So as I said earlier, I'm going to go through the history of the band counsel system. I just have to take a moment and talk about this and recognize that we're going to be talking about the Indian Act, and myself personally, I find that just even that term very offensive. I think that I just want to take a moment and acknowledge that we need to prepare ourselves a little bit. The Indian Act has and continues to impact our lives in many different ways, and taking a moment to kind of acknowledge that and prepare for this conversation, I think, is important. So for myself, I typically take a deep breath in and then I exhale very slowly and let myself come down before I start talking about some of these things. So really, the ISK relationship, we call it the Crown-Saik'uz relationship, is really just rooted in colonization. It's about the assimilation of Indigenous people across Canada. And we know that that's been really aggressive. It's been brutal. And it continues to deeply impact our lives. And it's created this context where communities have prioritized healing because of dealing with that brutal colonial impact. I call that intergenerational trauma, some of the really deep things that people are suffering with. And today we see this stuff, in everyday, we call it procedural injustice. So for example, the nation still having to participate in the consultation framework, those kinds of things. So to give you a context, this is kind of I call it the 6 boxes of kind of the history of the Indian Act. So in 1876, the Indian Act was imposed, and it was, really designed, as I said earlier, to disrupt the hereditary systems, the matriarch system, and to really displace Indigenous people from their land and the ability to manage their land. It was a resource grab and still is today. But what that did is it created a legislative authority for every band council system. So when you think about where the council gets its power to exercise decision-making, those kinds of things, it comes from this Indian Act. So band councils were created in the 1870s under the Indian Act, and yes, they derived their authority from that. They were meant to resemble municipal governments, and so when you think about a municipal government, that would be like the Vanderhoof, right? Prince George City Council. That's an example of a municipal government, and that's the way that the Indian Act kind of laid out and mapped the powers of council, was to be exactly the same as a municipal government. So just like municipalities are subordinate to the province, councils are considered subordinate to the federal jurisdictions. So we think about it like an extension, if you will, of the federal government. That's kind of the reality of the creation of band councils. And one very important thing to note here, and this is why you see it again and again and again, the band council and the band are only authorized to act by way of majority vote. So this is why you see in things like pathways and other agreements this idea that when you get to the end, it requires a community vote and a majority community vote because of this restriction in the Indian Act. So these are kind of the sections of note that I like to look at. So, you know, I'm not going to go through each one independently, but I think it's really important that you understand that the Indian Act spells out these things. So, for example, Section 20, the possession of reserve lands, Section 53 to 60, management of reserves and designated and surrendered lands. You've got Section 61 to 69, management of Indian monies, including governing the trusts, revenue accounts, etc. Your auditor was here today just before me to speak to you. That is one of the requirements, not just from the Indian Act, but also as we get into this a little bit further, it's one of the executive obligations that your council has to you as members, for whom these programs and the nation's services, Section 35, all these great land management stuff, this is all for you, for the members. The powers of council are spelled out in Section 81, and the legal rights of both the band and the band council are in 88 to 90. This next piece, fiduciary responsibility, is really important. It's kind of at the foundation of your council's decision-making and responsibility, and I'm going to show you an example of sometimes where those responsibilities can be at odds and what that looks like. So a fiduciary responsibility is one in which one party, so the fiduciary, I'm going to say in this example it's the band council, okay, is responsible for looking after the best interests of another party, or we call that the beneficiary. So that would be the membership. So lots of levels of governance have fiduciary responsibilities. So band councils, executives, you know, economic boards. If you're on, even myself, I'm a volunteer on my son's school council. I have a fiduciary responsibility to the success of that school. Those are all kind of normal things that you see is a fiduciary responsibility. But there are three levels. One is executive, one is legislative, and one is judiciary. And we're going to go through them. Most often, it's executive and legislative that your council is dealing with. And we'll go through that a little bit more closely. So, executive fiduciary responsibility, you can think of it like the executive process that's required in order to get to a corporate or executive decision. So we often talk about like for example, the presentation that was made today earlier by Crystal. Crystal got up here and talked about the financial management policies and processes of the nation. That's a prime example of an executive fiduciary responsibility. And obviously, it's being done well because your auditor came and gave you good news, right? So this is an example where counsel has that executive obligation to demonstrate that due process or diligence. It also is really important to note that when your counsel makes a decision, those decisions, the executive obligations, are enforceable by the Supreme Court. Now, up until really recently, this was probably the only fiduciary responsibility that your counsel would be dealing with, basically managing the financial programs and services of the nation, and really that Crown or ISK, Saik'uz relationship. The next form of fiduciary responsibility is legislative, and this is the one that is really coming to light right now. It is really super important. And the reason is that it deals with the protection of your Section 35 rights. So the rights that are protected by the Constitution, your rights to hunt, fish, trap, have economic opportunities, have spiritual places, all those things are protected by Section 35. But the Crown has been infringing on those for decades and justifying it through, their mechanisms of, well, we infringe on Section 35 rights in order to have a regional kind of a growth or a regional outcome. But more and more, that is changing, and those justifiable infringements are being challenged in the courts. And that's a really important point. So you can see here, through the G2G negotiations, such as Pathway Forward and the court decisions on Rio Tinto, this fiduciary responsibility is ever growing for counsel. It's continuously building and growing. The judiciary is a really less frequent form of fiduciary responsibility. It often refers to a corporate entity, maybe upholding the Crown's or First Nations regulatory decision-making. So the best way I can explain this is, let's say Saik'uz was going to partner with a mine. I'll just use that as an example. And that mining company wanted to go around the land stewardship process, okay? That would not be allowed in that relationship because the nation's got its own regulatory decision-making. So this is an example of that. It's less frequent, but it's really something just to think about and to introduce you to those three forms. So, as I said earlier, fiduciary responsibility is really at the foundation of decision-making for your counsel. It's like what drives formal decisions. And so what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about the fiduciary responsibilities and how they impact decision-making. And I'm going to give you one example that's already in place. So remember, as I said earlier, the fiduciary responsibilities of counsel are really the foundation of formal decision-making. So when counsel sits down, they're going to be looking at, what are our obligations, both legislative and executive? How are we going to make this decision? But there are times when a fiduciary obligation can conflict with the interests of the nation, between the nation's programs and services, and in this example, economic growth. So this is how most so about, I don't know how many years ago this was, probably one of the finance people can tell me, but it was the Financial Transparency Act, I believe. What year did that come out in? 2012. 2012, was it 2012? Yeah, so it really shifted kind of the landscape for how nations were thinking about economic development and structuring your economic development companies. And the reason I use this example is because There's a reason that chief and counsel appoint a board of director to manage each of the, let's say, companies or entities under the DevCorp. And typically, that's because you will see the fiduciary obligation, responsibility of chief and counsel is to the membership, right? It's to make sure your programs and services, your financial surplus is all looked after. But that can conflict sometimes with economic development or corporate decisions, because sometimes you might run a loss for a company for a couple years, and you know that you're going to do that. That really flies in the face of the nation's fiduciary responsibility to the Crown SFN relationship, as well as to you as members. In other words, you don't want to see money that's used for programs and services somehow be used for economic development, which may look like a loss. So that's an example. I hope I've done a reasonable job of explaining that, and I'm certainly open to questions. But it's an example where, on one hand, you have a responsibility to the program services members, and on the other hand, you want to engage in economic growth, and sometimes the two don't align. And so this is why we have this structure where you have a board of directors who then make those corporate decisions, and they are arm's length from council. The next section I want to talk about is the changing role of counsel. As I said earlier, more and more and more, your nation is out in front of the old ISK model, very much. And this is changing kind of how counsel is thinking about what is our role? How are we responding to those legislative fiduciary responsibilities? Yeah.
What's ISK?
Oh, DIA.
Oh,
They keep changing their name. They're trying to trick you. It's DIA.
Okay.
New name, same thing.
Yeah, new name, same thing, but yeah, it's DIA, basically INAC, ANSI, Indigenous Service Canada, yeah. They call it ISK for short, yeah. I should just say DIA, right? Yeah, okay. I'll just say DIA from now on. Never mind ISK. So, as I said earlier, the role of band counsel is really in transition, and it's so exciting. Myself, personally, I think it's just, I get up in the morning and I think about what's possible, and it's really exciting to me, personally. And, you know, that Crown relationship with DIA is just way less important as nations are moving towards own source revenue and increased revenue sharing with government and industry. It's a really different landscape than it was 20 years ago, like no doubt in my mind. So the main thing, I'm going to teach you a little bit of legal something here. So this expansion of counsel roles, it's really driven by the courts. And so what happens is, well, let's just say when the courts make a decision that's a new interpretation of, say, an existing right, it creates a precedent, and in legal terms we call that case law. And that case law continues to expand the jurisdiction of counsel. So, for example, you know, when you think about the Silcoteen decision in 2014, so title, the TNG, Silcoteen National Government, awarded 5 bands come together under Silcoteen Nation. 25 years of litigation, and the Silcoteen decision is made in 2014. It expressly gives title. But that's the start. Now, how do those councils, what is the governance process to think about jurisdiction? Because they don't want to manage highways. That costs a lot of money, right? What aspects of title do you want? What do you want to pay for? What do you want to manage, right? Those kinds of things. And so when I say it's changing, it's not only is it changing, but it's a consistent negotiation. You're constantly pushing to get further and further ahead, both through the courts and through your negotiations. So I love this example, but after courts make a decision, BC has this imperative. They're legally required to respond. And so what they do is they kind of ramp up and they start investing in these new kind of, I'm going to say, policies, kind of protecting the province's interests. So you have decisions that were made, like, very recently. You have the Pathway Forward Agreement, which comes out of the 2013 judicial review of the environmental assessment process. That led to the collaboration agreement, which has now morphed into Pathway Forward 2.0. But one that I've seen and I've seen the provincial mount up very recently as well, is the Yahe or Blueberry River decision. Yeah, so last year that decision was made in the courts, and then this year the province has basically put all their resources, they've got everybody up in Treaty 8 trying to work on how do you go forward with this understanding of cumulative impacts and the need for the province to not be the managers of that territory. So then then you start the Westmo, Soto, all the Treaty 8 nations are coming together now to try to come up with how do we manage the land? Well, that's a really big expansion of a council power, right? So this is what I'm saying about the changing landscape. It's changing all the time. Every time a decision is made in the courts and the province ramps up, your council has to respond to that. So, as I said earlier, there are 3 levels of fiduciary responsibility. One of them is legislative. It's about protecting your Section 35 rights. So every time a new case law occurs, the council has that responsibility to ensure that the nation's Section 35 rights are protected and upheld. So it's a kind of like a cycle, if you will. Hey, Jackie, that's like a good way. So you get a court case, it makes a decision, the province ramps up, the nation needs to respond, and then you kind of work to figure out how you get to the next court case, and then it starts all over again, right? And in between that, the province might be sliding in a little G2G agreement. Hey, we'd like to work on ecosystem restoration. We'd like to understand your economic development in the territory. What would you be willing to look at? Those kinds of things. That ramp up, as you think about the cycle, court case, BC ramp up, nation ramp up. That's a really tough cycle to be in because you never know when it's going to happen, right? You don't know how you're going to have to ramp up to respond. And this is what your council is starting to think about. How are we going to go forward looking at these legislative responsibilities, thinking about the expansion of our council powers? And I think it's wonderful, frankly, because not many other nations are doing that. And they're doing it in a very strategic way. So again, just to reiterate, it's a big shift from the old days of managing DIA funds. So this is where I'm going to get into kind of the exploration that your council, I think it's fair to say this is the starting place, right? So, this is like setting the stage, if you will, for what that exploration is going to look like and how it's, strategic, right? It's not just about, okay, well, we're going to put 4 more counselors in there. No, that's not it. It's about how do we align, how do we think about what's coming, what our opportunities are, what are we able to do to define the role of council in relation to our executive obligations, meaning that financial management, those executive processes, and our legislative obligations, Section 35 rights. So your council is going to look at things like how do we define that. How does it align with our election code and our policies and organizational mandates? So Council's built a strategic plan that identifies objectives to explore this alignment and prepare for growth. It's coming. Legal land use planning is coming. You know, when you think about examples like Gitineau, after 10 years they achieved a legal recognition of how they want their territory managed. But then that means you take on all that management, right? So you have to build to that. You're not ready to do it now. So what does it look like to build towards it? And that's the kind of stuff that your council's starting to think about. So also looking at refining the mandate and governance processes of the organization. So make sure that executive fiduciary responsibility is tight, because it is the segue to self-government. Make sure that legislative responsibility is understood and is clearly articulated through your policies, through your governance processes, and through the election code. Also right now, your council has been supporting building out a management team. And can you still hear me? Yeah, something popped out. Anyway. That's really helping to build these executive processes to support Saik'uz to take on these new jurisdictions and to think about self-government. So what did I do? That's okay. I'm a hand talker, right? I'm a hand talker. Stuff flies off. So I'm really excited because, you know, you've got council kind of saying, here's where we want to go strategically. We're building a management team to help us achieve that, right? And to help plan for growth. And so, you know, when you think about that cycle that I described, how do you know what's the trigger for growth? How do you start to define that, and how does your team build that up? And more importantly, what is it to be an Indigenous organization? Some of those kinds of contemplations. How is the hereditary system or traditional, how are elders brought in? How are community members a part of this? So they're exploring all of that and really thinking about this greater jurisdiction. As I said to you earlier, legal land use planning is coming. That will be a legal shift on the landscape where Saik'uz will be determining how management of the territory looks, how certain values like water and fish and trees are all looked after. And that's going to require a lot of growth in terms of the ability to manage and to move towards self-government. So I know that Saik'uz Council has committed to explore traditional governance as part of this exercise. Part of the exploration includes that. And we'll work with membership to explore the changing roles of council and really ensure that it aligns with governance principles, election code,